World War II glider assault tactics. Introduction. Gliders came of age as a military tool in World War II, providing a means of delivering troops, equipment, and supplies onto a battlefield. Glider troops were, from the operational standpoint, air assault troops equivalent to today's helicopter-delivered airmobile units. Their use was relatively short-lived. There were few post-war instances of glider use, and glider riders were relegated to history by the 1950s after an active combat period of only 10 years. Previously, gliders or sailplanes had carried only 1 or 2 men, and were mainly used for basic pilot training and sport competition. But just about anything can be adapted to military use, and troop-carrying gliders capable of transporting a squad or more were developed just before the war. It was not long before even larger models were developed, carrying more troops, heavy cargo, artillery, anti-tank guns, jeeps, and even light tanks. Much has been made of the danger of glider landings, leading to these craft being called flying coffins, purple heart boxes, and tow targets. Landings could certainly be hazardous, especially at night, when gliders were at least too close to, too far from, or over the wrong landing zones. While there was an increased degree of danger, however, it was probably no worse than that faced by men debarking from landing craft on defended beaches crowded with obstacles. There were many successful glider operations in which the force committed experienced few crashes and casualties, especially when conducted in daylight with suitable landing zones and experienced tuggercraft crews. The value of gliders in World War II is difficult to assess. The numbers of troops delivered to the battlefield were relatively small. There was certainly a value in introducing infantry units accompanied by artillery and mortars in the enemy's rear. Even if the landing was expected, the enemy could not know when or where it would take place, in what strength, nor with what objectives. The most noteworthy operations were the mass air landings of American and British troops in Normandy in June 1944 and the Netherlands that September, and as part of the leap over the Rhine in March 1945. A less heralded but successful operation was the delivery and resupply of British Chindet deep penetration brigades behind Japanese lines in Burma in March 1944. Gliders could also be employed to fly in reinforcements of men, equipment, and supplies to ground troops, and the Japanese used them in this way in the embattled Philippines. Among the most valuable glider operations were small-scale precision attacks, coups de main. Examples are the German seizure of Fort Eben Emael in 1940 and their rescue of Mussolini in 1943, and the British attack on Pegasus Bridge in the early hours of D-Day. While gliders were often committed in conjunction with paratroopers and were integral to airborne divisions, they were sometimes employed alone. Small supporting operations also proved valuable, such as flying surgical teams into besieged Bastogne and the rescue of crash survivors in New Guinea. This book will not examine specific battles in any detail, since there are other Osprey books covering most of these. Instead, this text devotes the available space to a discussion of the characteristics of military gliders, how they functioned, their capabilities and limitations, pilot training, tug aircraft, and how glider and tug units integrated, and the organization, equipment, and weapons of glider infantry and artillery units. The focus will be on British and German glider operations, since the Soviet Union and Japan made only limited use of gliders. Origins. While it is a matter of debate, it is believed that the first person to be carried aloft in a heavier than our craft in sustained gliding flight was an unidentified 10-year-old boy in a machine built by Sir George Cayley of Brompton Hall, Yorkshire, which was towed downhill into a breeze by manpower at some date in 1852 or 1853. Shortly afterwards, Sir George sent his coachman a pinnet. The coachman survived, but according to an eyewitness, he immediately won. Some relevant Osprey titles are listed on the inside back cover of this book. Others are battle orders for German airborne divisions, Blitzkrieg 1940-41, BTO 15, German airborne divisions, Mediterranean Theater, 1942-45. BTO 22 U.S. Airborne units in the Mediterranean Theater, 1942-44. BTO 25 U.S. Airborne divisions in the ETO, 1944-45. Campaign 24, Arnhem, 1944. CAM 178, The Rhine Crossings, 1945. CAM 147, Crete, 1941. CAM 210, Operation Dragoon, 1944. CAM 251, Sicily, 1943. CAM 257, Salerno, 1943. CAM 249, Verkers, 1944. And Manaderms 139, German airborne troops, 1939-45. Quit his job. In 1856, Frenchman Jean-Marie Lebris flew a glider launched from a horse-drawn cart. The German Otto Lilienthal became known as the Glider King, making 2,000 highly publicized hang glider flights from 1891, until a deadly crash in 1896 made him the first known glider fatality. In the meantime, in 1884, John J. Montgomery made the first manned, controlled, heavier-than-air glider flights in America, launching off a Californian mesa, and continued experimenting until he too crashed in 1911. Soaring became a popular sport in the early 1920s, and it was not long before glider competitions for range and endurance evolved. In 1920, a German set a record by flying 2 kilometers, 1¼ miles in 2 minutes. 11 years later, the distance record was 272 kilometers, 169 miles. In post-World War I Germany, where developing powered aircraft was initially prohibited but civilian, aircraft were permitted from 1922. Government-sponsored glider programs spread the interest. Gliding was demonstrated at the 1936 Berlin Olympics and would have been recognized as a qualifying sport in the cancelled 1940 Tokyo Olympics. By 1937, Germany had produced some 50,000 glider pilots, many of whom would subsequently become Luftwaffe aircrew. The first officially recognized glider organization was the R-Hahn-Rossittan Gesellschaft, RRG, which not only pioneered sport gliding in Germany but inspired its spread throughout the world. In 1933, the RRG was broken up by the Nazis, and the Deutsche Forschungsanstalt, Fahr Segelflug, German Research Institute for Sailplane Flight, DFS, took over glider development. To include military gliders, the Flieger Hitler Jugend Flying Hitler Youth, and the National Sozialist Fliegerkorps National Socialist Flying Corps. NSFK took over youth and adult glider training and competition. In 1937, the Germans built a meteorological research glider, carrying a pilot, 2 meteorologists, and research instruments. This would be the forerunner of German troop-carrying gliders. Gliding emerged as a sport in Russia in the early 1900s, with Soviet government-sponsored activities from 1923. The OSOAVIASIM Union of Societies of Assistance to Defense and Aviation, Chemical Defense of the USSR was formed in 1927 to provide youths and adults with all forms of pre-military training and included a glider training program. By 1934, the USSR had 57,000 glider pilots hereafter, GPs, and in 1941, it held 13 of the 18 world soaring records. Pre-World War II sport gliders were 1 and 2-man sailplanes of very light construction, designed for speed and range. The Soviets began experimenting with multi-place gliders in the early 1930s. The initial effort was to develop powered freight gliders carrying a ton of cargo. These were towed aloft and then released, using a low-powered engine to extend their range to deliver freight to far-flung regions, augmenting the inadequate rail and road systems. By 1935, the Red Army was experimenting with troop-carrying gliders. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky held theories about deep operations into the enemy's vulnerable rear to vertically outflank him, and his influence added emphasis to the glider and parachute effort. Since at that time the Soviets permitted the Germans to operate a secret fighter pilot school at Luftwaffe, officers observed Soviet glider demonstrations. which in their turn influenced German concepts. It is a matter of debate whether it was Gen Kurt's student, future, commander of the Foul Sturmtruppen Paratroopers, or Gen Ernst Udet, another Luftwaffe innovator who first urged further development of troop-carrying gliders. Student viewed them as a means to rapidly land assault units. To make direct attacks on enemy positions, Udet thought of them as a means of covertly landing small numbers of troops in the enemy rear to seize key objectives such as bridges and road choke points. In the event, the Luftwaffe would employ them for both types of mission. On May 10, 1940, 10 German gliders delivered 78 paratroopers atop the strategic Belgian artillery fortress of Eben-Emael near Liege. The first combat use of gliders. Against odds of at least 10 to 1, the paratroopers neutralized the fortress in less than half an hour with minimal casualties, and its 1,100-strong garrison surrendered the following day. A year later, 750 glider troops were landed on Crete to support 10,000 paratroopers, 5,000 airlifted mountain soldiers, and 7,000 sea-delivered troops. The glider contribution was small, but they aided in seizing key objectives. By now, the Allies had been taught the value of gliders and set out to employ them on a large scale themselves. The gliders, 1- and 2-person sailplanes for recreation and pilot training, were extremely lightweight. They were designed slim to cause the least possible drag, and had long, narrow wings for greater lift. They could either be towed aloft by a small single-engine aircraft, or towed along the ground by a vehicle, or a power winch until they achieved launch speed. Once aloft, pilots soared from thermal to thermal, the rising hot air reflected by open fields or built-up areas to reach higher altitudes, possessing a high glide ratio. Horizontal distance versus altitude loss, they could stay aloft for long periods and fly long distances. Such a ratio might be around 20 or 30 to 1, i.e., in the latter case, for every 30 feet of horizontal flight, the sailplane lost only 1 foot of altitude. Landings were made on grass airfields, using belly skids. Military glider characteristics. Military gliders had to be larger and less streamlined, since they had to carry from a minimum of 8 to considerably greater numbers of troops or heavy equipment, cargo, and even vehicles. While they had to be relatively lightly constructed, they still had to be robust enough to lift heavy loads and to withstand landings on irregular ground with a high probability of striking obstacles. While it was hoped that they could be recovered and reused, this was seldom possible. Most gliders making combat landings were simply abandoned to be stripped of anything usable and the remains burned. The British did dismantle many, however, and transported them home for refurbishing, and the Americans snatched some flyable gliders back into Thayer with low-flying C-47 Seaplane H. Military gliders often had a boxy fuselage to maximize load space, but circular or oval cross-section designs were common. Most had high-set wings, level with the top of the fuselage. Gliders were typically built of wooden framing, aluminum or steel tubing, or combinations of both, covered with thin plywood, or aircraft fabric, or plywood covered with fabric. Doped fabric coated with a plasticized lacquer was quite tough, airtight, and waterproof. Usually there was a mix of skin-covering materials on different components. Landing gear might be skids or wheels. Many had wheels for takeoff, which were jettisoned. Once airborne, the landing being undertaken on skids. Troop or cargo doors might be on one or both sides. Alternatively, the nose or tail sections might open for cargo loading and unloading by means of ramps that were stowed aboard. Troop seats were often ranged along the cargo compartment sides facing inward, but might be positioned crossways and facing forward or rearward. Seats were removable in order to accommodate heavy equipment or bulk cargo, and cargo tie-down points were provided. Seat belts were fitted. Once belted in, the troops had little to do, except hang on for a sometimes turbulent ride. They handheld their weapons, though the Germans provided racks and were ordered to remain seated. Moving about the compartment only made the pilot's job harder. No flashlights were permitted, so as to preserve the pilot's night vision. Typically there were few fuselage side vision ports for the troops, though these would have helped them orient themselves before debarking. Being designed for either troops or cargo, gliders had to carry a certain amount of sandbag ballast when undertaking training flights so as to maintain the necessary center of gravity. Most gliders had two pilots in case of a casualty, sitting side by side and well forward. Well-designed cockpits, though not all, were provided a wide field of vision to aid in locating the LZ and downward vision immediately. Below the nose was highly desirable. Gliders were provided with minimal instruments. Those aboard a US Waco CG-4A included airspeed indicator, climb indicator, turn and bank indicator, altimeter, compass, and switches for instrument, landing, and recognition lights. All were important, but monitoring of the airspeed was essential. The pilot had to pay attention to speed when lifting off, ensuring that the glider reached the specified speed. Before leaving the ground, he needed to ensure the tug aircraft was not going too fast or too slow, that the glider was at the correct speed when it was released. That speed was reduced as he approached the LZ, but remained above stalling speed when lift could not be maintained, and that he was traveling at the correct landing speed before touching down. Flight controls were basic: a steering wheel or a yoke to operate wing, ailerons and tail stabilizers, plus foot pedals to operate the rudder. The typical military glider had virtually no climb capability, owing to its weight and design that maximized cargo space. When they were released from their tug aircraft, they immediately began to lose altitude, and the LZ or an emergency alternate had to be within sight. Their typical glide ratio was 10-1, the glider losing 1 foot of altitude for every 10 feet of horizontal flight. However, the small German DFS 230s had a ratio of 18-1, and in May 1941 they were released 2 to 5 miles off the Cretan coast from an altitude of 5,000 feet. During the 1945 Rhine crossing U.S. gliders were released from 400 to 800 feet. Half were hit by ground fire, though only 6 were shot down. During the same operation, the British released at 2,500 to 3,500 feet, having 2/3 hit and 10 downed. Typical towing speeds of troop-carrying gliders were in the 150 to 160 miles per hour range, but they could safely be towed at up to 30 miles per hour faster. Stall speeds were 50 to 70 miles per hour, and landing speeds just above that. Glider flying, there might be intermittent turbulence as the tug maneuvered to join the formation and at cruising altitude. Clear air turbulence was common during the flight, i.e. when the aircraft flew through areas with different temperatures. Hot air rises, cool air drops. What was erroneously called an air pocket was an area of cooler air that caused the aircraft to suddenly drop. Usually, it's only a few feet, but it felt like more to the passengers. Tug aircraft were usually twin-engine transports or medium bombers, and the Germans also used the Junkers Ru-52 trimotor transport. For lighter gliders and short-range tows, single-engine aircraft were occasionally used, but seldom for operational missions. Heavier cargo gliders required the power of 4-engine bombers. Gliders were sometimes double-towed, i.e. a tug towed to gliders from same hook on 2 separate ropes, one longer than the other. A very real concern was that the glider on the shorter rope might get entangled with the longer, so both pilots had to remain constantly alert to maintain a 75 feet separation. A double tow also placed greater strain on the tug, increased fuel consumption, and required longer runways. The British never used double tows operationally, and the US made only limited use of them in Burma and for the 1945 Rhine crossing. Glider pilots also had to closely watch their vertical distance above or below the tug's line of flight. Flying too high or too low might break the tow rope or affect the flight characteristics of either the tug or the glider. Depending on the type of tug and the airspeed, there were preferred angles. Slightly above or below the tug's line of flight in order to experience less turbulence. At night, this positioning was maintained relative to the V pattern formed by the tug's wingtip and taillights. The standard tow rope for the USCG-4A was 350 feet long and of 11/16 in diameter. Made of nylon, it would stretch an additional 25% its length. This made it less likely to break, though this was still a common occurrence. The rope did not remain under constant tension, but repeatedly stretched and slackened off owing to winds and air turbulence, both natural and caused by propwash. A broken rope could be disastrous if over water or enemy-controlled territory, or when there were no suitable LG nearby. 4 double tows, 350 feet, and 425 feet ropes were used. The British used 300 feet, long 2 inches diameter hemp or manila ropes for the heavier Horsa and Hamilcar gliders. The small German DFS 230 used 40 meters, 130 feet, 60 meters, 200 feet, 100 meters, 330 feet, and 120 meters, 400 feet long ropes, depending on airfield space. A special release hook had to be installed on tug aircraft. Some tugs were purpose-built with hooks, but these often had to be installed in the field, along with a release lever in the cockpit. The rope connector and release on. Gliders might be in the center of the nose or above or below it. Some gliders used a yoke or Y ropes, a long rope dividing into 2 shorter lengths, each attached to a connector on one wing. Intercommunication. Communication between the glider and tug pilots was essential. Telephones or wire intercoms were the logical choice, but led to problems. The Americans first taped telephone wire to the tow rope, but soon found that while the rope stretched, the wire did not. It was then taped to the rope, allowing plenty slack between each tape point. But violent, excessive stretching would still break the wire, as did abrasion when dragged down the runway during takeoff. The British first wrapped the wire around the rope, then wove it into the rope's core. While this protected it from abrasion and the thick hemp, rope did not stretch much, the wire could still break. Small, short-range radios were to be fitted late in the war, but while the mountings were provided in new CG, for as at the factories few radios actually reached units, one of the most effective means of day and night communication was an Aldous blinker lamp, flashing simple codes. For example, green meant LZ spotted. Release now. This was used from the Astrodome just after the C-47's cockpit, and British bomber tugs had similarly located Astrodomes. Waggling wings and fishtailing tails were also used as ad hoc signals, as were flashing wingtip lights. Releasing the tow rope, the most important signals were to alert the pilot that the LZ was near and that the tug was releasing the rope. Both the tug and glider pilots could release the rope, but each was to alert the other before doing so. If the tug's takeoff, it would immediately release, and the glider swerved off the runway to avoid it. An in-flight emergency en route to the LZ might be caused by enemy action fighters, flak, tug engine problems, bad weather, or loss of visual contact. There were incidents in which the tug took severe evasive action and or sped up to avoid flak without first warning the GP2 release. If exceeding the safe tow speed, gliders had to release. The tug glider formation would try to avoid clouds and fog. This frequently led to formations, breaking up when skirting around bad weather, and even 2 lone tugs straying off course, never to rejoin the formation. Within clouds or fog, GPs could not see the tug, and it took only moments for them to become disoriented as to
how their position relative to it.
The tug pilot could not simply yank the glider into position behind him like a truck towing a trailer. The glider would quickly drift to one side or too far above or below the tug's line of flight and endanger other aircraft in the formation. In such a situation, gliders had to release and make their way out of the cloud or fog, taking a chance on colliding with tugs and other released gliders and praying that there was an LZ within range. In emergencies, tug pilots were urged to avoid releasing their tow, if at all possible, as there was a good chance its passengers would be lost to sea below. Glider operations Sicily. It was also essential that they warn the GP they were releasing and, if at all possible, allow him to actually execute the release himself. This was because if the rope was overly taut, or even fairly slack, it might spring back into the glider's nose, causing severe damage or even killing the pilots. The released rope could also damage a wing, or wrap, around it and thus prevent the ailerons from functioning. The GP would release the rope at his end as soon as he realized the tug had released, failing. To release a rope still attached to the nose would result in it trailing to the rear, perhaps snagging a tree when landing. Normally, when the GP visually located the LZ and released his end of the tow, the tug would turn away from the line of flight to avoid maneuvering gliders and retain the rope for a short time to ensure that falling ropes did not cause any undue hazard. Sometimes rope dropping areas were designated so that ropes could be recovered later. This was always done in training, with even the rope drop altitude specified. Ropes were not to be dropped on hard runways or rocky areas, so as to avoid abrasion. Glider landings. Every landing is a crash landing was a glider pilot's catchphrase. Planned accident. While pilots of powered aircraft looked down on GPs, they overlooked the unique challenges that the latter faced. The GPs had no second chances in the case of too long or too short an approach. They could not abort the landing and come around for another attempt. Once released, they had to land at their first attempt and could not remain aloft while they looked for a better LZ. They had to be good every time. The route map, usually handled by the co-pilot, was marked with checkpoints, easily in theory identified from the air, including at night. These might be an island, town, river confluence particularly easy to identify in daylight or on a moonlit night, highway or railroad junction, or any distinctive terrain feature. There were instances when ships were on station. Searchlights pointed vertically upward to serve as a checkpoint at sea. Routes were planned to avoid known enemy flak concentrations or flying over friendly invasion fleets. See below. Glider operations, Sicily. The tug pilot would notify the GP when a checkpoint was sighted. The final checkpoint was termed the initial point IP. This had to be very easy to identify, and it provided a compass azimuth to the LZ, which was within sight from the IP. Ideally, pathfinders on the LZ marked it with colored smoke, not only to identify it but also to give pilots a wind indicator. Such marked LZ were rare luxury, however, and were impossible when conducting surprise attacks, like Ebonimel, Gran Sasso, and Pegasus Bridge. For large-scale operations, LZ, usually identified by a letter, was not a single open field, but a large area that was probably crisscrossed by hedgerows, fences, walls, tree lines, and roads. The area selected was simply one with fewer natural and man-made obstacles than other areas. They were chosen for their absence of mines, posts, and flooded areas, the scarcity of high obstructions, tall trees, power lines, towers, etc., and their proximity to the troops' objectives. But none were ever ideal from the viewpoint of the glider pilots. As with takeoffs, landings were conducted into the wind to provide greater lift. Release altitude varied but had to be fairly high, often 4,000. 5,000 feet owing to the low glide ratio of fully loaded gliders. They were usually released within 3 miles of the LZ and often much closer. Having smaller gliders with a higher glide ratio, the Germans often released high and made a long shallow approach as at Ebonimel, or released above the objective and spiraled tightly down to land on a point LZ as at Gran Sasso. While high altitude release was necessary, the higher the release, the more difficulties the GPs might encounter. Winds can blow at different speeds and different directions at different altitudes. Often the tugs and gliders would pass the LZ with a tailwind, and then
a release.
While descending, the gliders would bank in the necessary direction, then turn into a headwind for the final approach. Upon release, the passengers were aware of an almost immediate drop, though slight, and the ride was generally smoother now they were out of the tug's prop wash. Above the faint sound of rushing wind, passengers might hear gunfire, and closer to the ground they could make out the engine noise of vehicles on nearby roads. Depending on the landing ground's composition, vegetation, and obstacles, landing could be quite noisy, followed by an immediate silence once the gliding glider stopped, except for battle sounds and shouted orders to get out. The pilots wanted to approach the LZ at a shallow angle of descent, and since they might have to clear obstacles, they often maintained the higher end of the acceptable range of landing speed. This provided additional lift to allow the pilot to pull back on the steering wheel to clear low obstacles before touching down. Walls, hedgerows, power lines, tree stumps, posts, ditches, gullies, sunken roads, and similar surprises could be disastrous. Running into a low wall, a ditch, or a gully could cause the glider to flip over, as could the skids digging into soft ground and a tree or post tearing off one wing caused a ground spin or flip. For later operations, the Americans retained wheels on their gliders to allow the brakes to be used to help swerve around obstacles. Heavy equipment like a jeep or a gun tearing loose from its restraints with the shock of landing could wipe out any passengers and often crashed right through the nose. There were instances when such loads broke loose in midair en route. If they rolled backward, the glider plummeted to the ground in an irrecoverable tail-first dive. If they slid forward, they usually tore through the cockpit and nose. The distance a glider required to come to a halt was highly variable, depended on touchdown speed, which could not be powered back or increased, as with a powered aircraft. Angle of approach, glider weight, surface, the composition, grass, wet or dry, bare earth, sand, rocks, and obstacles on the alert landing zone. As one pilot related to the author, it all depended on how many trees, brush, ditches, stone walls, and hedgerows you went through. Of course, the shorter the landing distance, the better. Some pilots even aimed for brush and hedges, though not hedgerows, which usually incorporated a berm or field wall in order to slow down. In some cases, barbed wire was wrapped around skids, or a pilot might rock the nose forward to increase friction. Landing slides scaled vary from 50 feet to 200 feet, or even more. As the glider came to a rest, the passengers immediately unbuckled their seatbelts and opened the exits. At least they did not have to worry about the risk of fire, as there was no fuel. If there was equipment aboard, some of them released the restraints and prepared to unload it, while the rest opened the nose, removed the tail section. Tools were available to aid them in cutting open. The fuselage and ramps or channels were carried. One or more first aid kits were stowed aboard gliders. Smart troops took these with them, or medical personnel recovered them later. Pilots and passengers quickly departed from landing sites since they drew enemy fire, and troops, enemy soldiers, routinely searched abandoned gliders for souvenirs or anything of use or of intelligence value. It was not uncommon for pilots to leave maps behind in their haste. Besides air landing troops and cargo, gliders were also considered as a means of delivering paratroopers. One concept was to load paratroopers in both the tug and the glider. This would reduce the number of transports, and with the glider following just above the tug's line of flight, the paratroopers could jump from both aircraft simultaneously. However, this placed a heavy strain on the tug's engines and increased its fuel consumption, and it was also difficult for paratroopers to move about inside and exit from cramped gliders. Another idea was to load the tug with paratroopers and the glider with non-paratroopers. The glider would be released and the tug would fly onto the paratroopers DZ. While the US, UK, USSR, and Germany all tested these concepts, paratroopers never jumped operationally from gliders. Glider types. American gliders. The U.S. Army Air Forces began testing gliders in July 1941, and the Waco CG-4A seaplane A entered production a year later. Of some 16,000 cargo and training gliders procured by the armed forces, 14,000 were Wacos. Waco CG-4A cargo glider was designed by Weaver Aircraft Company, whose initials spelt WACO, since the aircraft was not named for the city in Texas. This was pronounced Waco, Waco, or Waco, depending on whom you ask? 16 companies built a total of 13,909 CG-4A, more than any other U.S. aircraft except for B-24 bombers and P-47 and P-51 fighters. Production began in late 1942, but manufacturing delays limited there. Operational use in 1943. In all, 5,991 were shipped to Europe, 2,303 to the Mediterranean, and 504 to the Pacific. 150 of the latter were forwarded to India. Each Waco was shipped overseas in 5 large crates. They were assembled at air bases, a process requiring almost 250 man-hours each, which was often hampered by insufficient printed instructions and available skilled manpower. Several other designs of glider were adopted, usually with higher capacity, but few were built in any numbers before the war's end. The boxy-looking CG-4A was considered one of the uglier glider designs, but pilots were pleased with its performance, and thousands were used as trainers, owing to their ease of handling. The fuselage was of fabric-covered steel tubing with a honeycombed plywood belly and lower nose. The wide, straight wings were built of wood spars and braces clad in fabric-covered plywood. The plexiglass canopy provided excellent vision for the side-by-side pilots. The entire nose, including the pilot's seats, could be rotated up and back too, to give access for loading and unloading. The tail could be lifted and propped up with 2 support poles to tilt the open nose downward, allowing a jeep or other equipment to be loaded. To unload, the nose section was cranked up by hoisting cables and then held in place by a 7-foot prop. If the load was a jeep, its engine was started during the landing approach, and it was then unhooked from the tie-down straps and driven slowly forward. A cable attached to the jeep's trailer hitch raised the nose, which locked in place as the jeep moved forward, and a pair of short ramps were pushed out by the jeep. When locked, the cable automatically detached from the jeep, which could be driven out seconds after landing. The CG-4A could carry 15 combat-loaded troops on removable wooden bench seats, 7 down each side, plus a jump seat, or alternatively 7 litters, or up to 4,060 pounds of cargo. This might be a 37mm M3A1 or British 6PDR 57mm Mk2 gun, a 75mm M1A1 or 105mm M3 snubnose pack howitzer, or a 1/4 ton Jeep, P-ton trailer, and motorcycles. Compact engineer. Equipment designed for glider and aircraft transport included the Clark Air K21 bulldozer, Case SI wheeled tractor with front loader, Adams 11S, towed grader, 1/2 towed, 2-wheeled dump trailer, LaPlanche Haute Q carryall, scraper or compacting roller. Towing speed was 110 to 120 miles per hour by a variety of tugs, C-46, C-47, and C-54 transports, P-38 fighters, a 25 attack aircraft, or B. A total of 143 Wacos were needed for the 2-battalion glider infantry regiment, 59 for a battalion, and 11 for a rifle company. 4 Wacos were needed for a rifle platoon, with the company headquarters and weapons platoons split between the 2 rifle platoons, gliders, and a 9th one. The division artillery headquarters needed 16 gliders, a glider artillery battalion 68, and a battery 26. The engineer battalion headquarters and the glider engineer company needed 10 and 29 respectively. The AA battalion required 112 gliders, with 18 for each of its 6 batteries. The divisional service support companies needed 7 for the ordnance, 50 for the quartermaster, 5 for signal, 36 for medical, and 10 for the division headquarters company and MP platoon. The larger Waco CG-13A was a 30-seat glider capable of carrying 8,000 pounds, twice as much as the CG-4A. 37 of the production run had center seats added to allow 40 troops to be carried. Of similar design to the CG-4A, the CG-13A could be towed by a C-46, C-47, or C-54 transport, or a B-17, or a B-24 bomber. The nose could be lifted hydraulically. It could carry the short-barreled 105mm M3, or the standard M2A1 howitzer, a Jeep with ammunition trailer and crew, or a 1.5-ton cargo truck, but not the M22T9. Locust Light Tank. Production began in September 1943 of the 132 CG-13Es. Built, 81 were sent to Europe, where they flew only cargo delivery missions. 5 went to the Pacific, where 1 was employed in the war's final airborne operation. British gliders. The first British glider to see widespread use was the General Aircraft Limited, Hotspur Mk2, of which 997 were built. Its capacity of only 7 troops made it inadequate for combat, but it saw considerable use as a training glider. The primary British gliders were the Horsa Mki and 2 built by Airspeed Limited, Seaplate B. It was originally intended that the Horsa would drop Paratroopers, the awkwardly converted bombers that the RAF was then using. In that role, for lack of anything better, had only a limited capacity. As Dakotas, RAF C-47s became available, this requirement was cancelled, and the Horsa became the principal troop carrier. Apart from its metal floor and a large plexiglass canopy for the side-by-side pilots, it was built almost entirely of wood to conserve strategic materials and to put the country's woodworking factories to productive use. Its tricycle undercarriage was retained for landing. The Mki's large cargo compartment had 25 seats, and the Mk2 had 28. It could alternatively carry 2 jeeps, or a jeep with either a trailer or a 6 PDR at gun, or 75mm pack howitzer. With ammunition, there was a troop access door aft on the right side, and cargo was loaded, albeit with difficulty, through a large forward fold-down door on the left side. A jeep barely fitted through this, even at an awkward angle, so loading required excessive time. A comparatively fast means of unloading was obviously needed, and was provided. The whole tail section from just aft of the wings could be neatly removed by firing a surcingle, a band of detonating cord that cut the construction bolts. Passengers dragged the cut tail section to the side. Ramps were emplaced, and the equipment was rolled out. An alternate method was developed by which 8 bolts were removed with supplied wrenches, wire cutters also being provided to cut the control and electrical cables. The det cord was still carried, however, as a backup. Horses with these quick-release bolts were designated red horses, and those without as white horses. The horse at Mk2 had a hinged nose that swung to the right for easier loading and unloading, though some Mki's were fitted with the quick-release tail section bolts. Blue horses in case the nose was too heavily damaged. To allow it to be opened, the Mk2 could carry 7,380 pounds of cargo to the Mki's 6,344 pounds. Other differences included the means of attaching tow ropes. That of the Mki attached under the nose, while the Mk2 used a Y-shaped yoke that divided 2 attached to each wing. The Mki had a theoretical capacity for rifles and Brin guns to be fired from top and belly hatches and the paratroop side doors, but this unnecessary feature was deleted from the Mk2. Between 4,000 and 5,000 horses were built, of which 400 were used by the U.S. because of their capacity to carry heavier weapons than the CG-4A. The largest glider used by the Allies was the General Aircraft Limited Hamilcar Mk1C Plate E, developed by the British to fulfill the perceived need for a heavy cargo glider to deliver artillery, larger at guns, engineer, equipment, bulk ammunition and supplies, and light armor. Production totaled 334 examples, while about the same length as the Horsa, the 110 feet. Wingspan made them the largest wooden aircraft in operational use. The forward end of the fuselage was bulbous to accommodate heavy cargo, with cockpit high on top seating the 2 pilots in tandem, protected by a bulletproof canopy and minimal armor. Aft of the high wide wings, the fuselage was comparatively narrow. The landing gear consisted of a pair of large wheels and a tail wheel, plus belly skids. The wheels were not jettisoned. Once the landing glider came to a halt, if the undercarriage was still intact, the pilots let the air out of the tires and drained the fluid from the landing gear. Hydraulics to lower the glider's belly. This allowed vehicles to exit through the hinged nose, which swung to the right. The nose had a plexiglass cone, and the underside was also glazed to allow the pilots to see downwardering landing. The Hamilcar could typically carry a 25 PDR gun howitzer or a 17 PDR-8 gun with its prime mover, 2 universal Bren gun carriers, 3 jeeps, 3 tank-drawn ammunition and fuel rototrailers, a light bulldozer. Combinations of the light, compact U.S. engineer equipment, see under WA COCG 4A above, or 40 troops. Its unique value was believed to be that it could carry 1 light tank, either a Vickers Mk7 Tetrarch or a US M22 Locust. Though in the event the powerful 17 PDR gun, the theoretical air landing TO&E for a British Airborne division called for 392 horses and 48 Hamilcars, but the 1st and 6th ABN divs were not. Identically organized, and each operation called for different loads. German gliders. With its head start in this field, Germany produced a number of unique designs. The most widely used was the Deutsche Forschungsanstalt Segelflug German Research Institute for Sailplane Flight DFS 230-30, an assault glider carrying only 9 troops Seaplate C. Actual production was by Gotthard Wagon Fabric, which built 2,230 examples. In fact, classified as a Leistensegelflug cargo-carrying glider, this small aircraft was ruggedly built with a fabric-covered welded steel tubular frame and high wings of fabric-covered plywood. It had a pair of jettisonable wheels for takeoff, and landing was accomplished by means of a centerline skid extending from the nose to midsection, plus a tail skid. The single pilot sat well forward. Behind him, the passengers sat astride centerline seats, the first 5 facing forward and the last 4 backward. Side windows were generously supplied to allow passengers to orient themselves. Before landing, and some DFS 230s were fitted with machine gun C-plate. 12 DFS 230s were required to deliver a 120-man company and up to 54 a battalion. The 4 rear seats could be removed to accommodate crew-served weapons, a motorcycle, munitions, etc., but the inability to remove the 5 forward seats limited its usefulness for delivering cargo. Later, production models added or rearranged the side doors to improve loading and exiting. And despite its limitations, the DFS 230 was extensively used to deliver light loads. The Luftwaffe even employed workshop gliders outfitted with machine tools, welding rigs, spare parts, lockers, and workbenches. Fighter and dive bomber Stuka groups on the Eastern Front would tow this from base to base as they advanced or retreated. A larger assault glider, though in fact never used in an assault, was the Gotha Go 242, which arrived in mid-1941. Gotthard Wagon Fabrik built 1,528 of these, of which 133 were later converted to Go 244 twin-engine powered transports. The Go 242 was built of steel tubing and bracing. It's covered with fabric with wings, twin tail booms, and tail unit of plywood. There were troop hatches in both sides, along with several vision ports. Although the Go 242 mainly served as a cargo glider, it could be armed quite heavily. There was provision for up to 8 MG-15 machine guns, though. Usually only 2 or 3 were fitted. The high-wing design with twin tail booms allowed for a hinged tail section to the central fuselage that could be raised to load and unload cargo. It could carry a Kübelwagen light car, 3.7 centimeters at gun, 7.5 centimeters infantry gun, or similar equipment, and there were seats for 23 passengers. Some later models were fitted to jump paratroopers. The early versions had jettisonable wheels for takeoff, a sprung nose skid, and 2 skids aft of the nose skid, 1 on each side of the belly beneath the wings. Later models had fixed wheels and belly skids, while the nose skid was placed by a wheel assembly that could double as a skid. As with the DFS 230-30, some were outfitted as aircraft workshops, and others as Unit Command Post 2, control fighter units operating from forward airfields. In North Africa, WWII were extensively used to transport supplies and troops. They were employed for the same purpose on the Eastern Front, as well as to supply advancing columns, or to deliver supplies and reinforcements to encircled units, and eventually to evacuate troops from the Crimea Peninsula. A headquarters designated the Grossraum Transportflieger for large-capacity transport leader was established in Warsaw to control glider and tug units on the Russian front. The largest glider ever built, and the largest operational aircraft built in World War II, was the Messerschmitt Me 321, aptly called the Giant, which had a 180 feet wingspan. Inspired by the perceived need for transport capacity for the anticipated invasion of Britain, it could airlift 16 tons, a medium tank, a 15 centimeters howitzer with its half-track prime mover, AT and AA guns of up to 8.8 centimeters, 2 trucks, other heavy weapons or bulk supplies including, for example, 52 fuel drums. The Giant was built of steel tubing and wooden spars covered with fabric. The pilots sat high, just forward of the wing. The first 100 machines had one pilot, and the second 102 plus a mechanic. Huge clamshell nose doors opened outward to reveal a cavernous cargo compartment designed to accommodate a standard railroad flat car load. There were troop doors in the fuselage sides aft of the wings. When carrying up to 140 troops, or 60 litters, a 2-story double deck was installed. There were numerous side ports for both levels and armament was for MG-15s. Despite its size, the Giant had only 2 main landing wheels and a small nose wheel. These could be jettisoned and the landing accomplished on skids, but in fact they were usually retained so the Giant could be towed home. The Me 321 was ostensibly used to haul equipment, supplies, and personnel to North Africa around the Eastern Front. The problem was getting the Giant off the ground with the available tug aircraft. It required a 4,000 feet runway, initially a Junkers SGU-94 engine. Transport was used as a tug, and then only with an empty Me 321. Only 18 Ru-90s had been built, and since there were no other aircraft capable of the feat, the Troika-Schlip towing technique was developed using 3 Messerschmitt Bf-110C twin-engine fighters in a V formation. Predictably, this proved costly in accidents, since flying in tight formation with triple to ropes required rare skill. Consequently, Heinkel designed the He-111Z for Zueling twin, 2 conjoined He-111H6 later H-16 bombers, connected by a common wing with 5 engines, 1 outboard of each fuselage, and 3 on the central wing. Even this still required rocket-assisted takeoff, with 4 rockets under each wing being dropped by parachute after they burned out. Only 12 He-111G were built, and owing to this shortage of suitable tugs, many Giganten were scrapped. Some were converted into powered Me 323, 6-engine transports, but most of the 198 Me 323s were in fact purpose built with greatly reinforced wings and more robust landing gear. Most of these lumbering giants were lost on the North Africa run. Tug aircraft. Glider towing was difficult at best, and potentially dangerous the more so. The tug had to strictly maintain specific takeoff, climbing, and cruising speeds, and to avoid sudden changes of altitude and course. Even if it came under fire, increasing or decreasing speed had to be done gradually. The tug pilot was in command of the tug-glider combination, but he was not supposed to release the glider unless absolutely necessary, Anthon only after alerting the glider pilot. Likewise, the glider pilot was to alert the tug if he was releasing. A common complaint was poor navigation on the tug's part, resulting in GPs not having sufficient time to visually locate the LZ even if they were near. It was not uncommon for glider formations to find themselves scattered and quite distant from their LZ, owing to poor navigation, winds blowing the formation off course, clouds and fog, flak, and inexperience in maintaining formations. while a variety of transports, bombers, and other aircraft, even twin-engine fighters, were employed as glider tugs. The most widely used were the twin-engine Douglas C-47 Skytrain, Dakota transport by the Allies, and the Junkers Ru-52 three-engine transport by the Germans. Numerous bombers and other aircraft were certified as tugs but seldom used. The British used four-engine bombers for their larger gliders even after sufficient C-47s became available, and the Germans used aircraft other than the Ru-52 out of necessity. Tug units. Note that the terms used by different air forces for units of different sizes are easily confused. USAAF units were termed from larger to smaller wing, group, and squadron, while equivalent RAF units were termed group, wing, and squadron, respectively. The equivalent Luftwaffe units were the Geschwader, Gruppe, and Staffel, each normally comprising 3 of the next smaller unit. The USAAF C-47s and C-46s were organized into 24-plane troop carrier squadrons. The British employed glider tug squadrons, usually with 24 aircraft, sometimes more, of varied and often mixed types, since British gliders were heavier than the USCG-4A. Some units were converted from bomber squadrons. Both the USAAF and RAF squadrons might be used for resupply drops and other transport missions in addition to glider towing. German tug units were initially designated Kampfgeschwader, Kampfruppsar, Besonderen, Verwindung Bomberwing, Group 4 Special Deployment, KGAKGRZBV, but were redesignated Transport Geschwader. During 1943, they also formed Schleppgruppen, Fahrleistenziegler towing groups for cargo gliders, with 2 squadrons each of 12X, go to 42s and own F-12X DFS 230s, as well as the tugs. To give an idea of the scope of Allied tug units, the USAAF X Troop carrier command units committed to towing gliders during the Normandy invasion included the 50th TC Wing 439th, 442nd TC Groups, and 53rd TC Wing 434, 438th TC Groups. Each of a wing's 4 groups had 4 squadrons, each with 13 XC-47s. Prior to the invasion, the establishment was increased from 52 aircraft per group to 73, of which 9 were spares. For Normandy, some 2,100 CG-4AS were shipped to Britain in crates. At first, unskilled civilian labor was used to assemble them, but even when USAF personnel were substituted, they too proved inadequate, and many gliders were judged unflyable. A rush effort was implemented, and 1,118 serviceable Wacos were actually available by D-Day. The British also provided U.S. units, with 301 horses for heavier cargo. In the RAF, 38 and 46 groups were the principal troop airlift and glider tug units. For Normandy, 38 Group had 10 squadrons, with 22 bombers, each to tow almost 1,100 horses and 30 Hamilcars. Glider pilots. Each country had different requirements and standards for glider pilots. The physical and skill requirements were lower than for powered aircraft, and they were often looked down on by real pilots, though the special. The challenges of their trade are described above, and many GPs had at least minimal powered aircraft experience. While there were some commissioned officers in command and staff positions, in most forces the actual GPs were sergeants, although the USAAF had a special warrant rank of flight officer. The US and UK lacked the pre-war government-sponsored glider programs that gave Germany and the Soviet Union an abundance of potential military pilots, though, in the event both countries would use fewer gliders than the US and UK. Their need for GPs was so pressing that commanders of army units were ordered to post notices calling for volunteers and to release any men who applied. America. In 1942, the U.S. Army unrealistically forecast the need for 12,000 GPs, though there were virtually no gliders nor training facilities. The first GPs undertook sailplane training at contracted civilian schools. These taught totally different skills than those needed for flying cargo gliders, but at least they offered some basic air experience. Few U.S. soldiers initially volunteered, and there were few qualified. Civilian GPs. The main source was cadets, who had failed conventional pilot training, but even these were limited in number, since many pilot washouts went on to qualify as bombardiers and navigators with commissioned rank. Standards were reduced for GPs, allowing a maximum age, 32 later, 35 as opposed to 26 for powered aircraft. They could also possess 10/100ths vision, correctable to 20/20ths spy spectacles, but otherwise they had to pass standard flight physicals. This allowed men who had private pilots' licenses to become GPS by not meeting full military standards. While there were standard course lengths and required numbers of flying hours, these were often not met due to shortages of gliders, tugs, and instructors. The preliminary plane gliding school lasted 5 weeks with 40 hours in Piper Cubs practicing dead stick, unpowered landings, and day and night instruction. There were 23 such schools, operated by civilian contractors, and on graduating students received their glider wings to boost morale, even though their training was far from finished. The elementary advanced glider school lasted 1 week with 8 flying hours in sailplanes, plus 1 week and 8 hours in cargo gliders. There were 7 of these schools, later replaced by advanced glider schools at 9 Army airfields. From May 1943, all advanced glider training was conducted at South Plains Army Air Field, Lubbock, Texas, which graduated the majority of the eventual 6,000 glider pilots. Glider mechanics were trained at Shepherd Field, Texas to assemble and maintain the craft. Initially, GP students were made staff sergeants when accepted for training. Upon graduation, they were made flight officers, equivalent to a warrant officer. This rank was created in July 1942 as a result of a dispute between the USAAF, who wanted GPs to be part of the troop carrier squadrons, and the infantry, who wanted them to be infantrymen who additionally knew how to fly. On its creation, existing staff sergeant GPs were promoted to the new rank. Flight and warrant officers had officer privileges. However, they were not commissioned by Congress but warranted by the War Department, and were regarded as third lieutenants. Glider pilots' flight pay was 50% extra, in addition to their base pay. American GPs were assigned to troop carrier squadrons as augmentees. 2 GPs for each of the 24, or occasionally 48 gliders, and glider mechanics were also assigned. They were informally organized as a GP flight or section. Within the squadron, troop carrier squadrons conducted practice in formation flying and navigation towing gliders, but troops were rarely carried on these flights. American GPs had a rather turbulent relationship with the real pilots and TC squadrons, being viewed as second-class pilots. However, it was common for GPs to fly as co-pilots in the squadron C-47s owing to co-pilot shortages, and also for C-47 co-pilots to co-pilot gliders. Co-pilots were not only necessary in case of casualties, but to help handle turbulence, which was exhausting. It was bad enough during the Rhine crossing that pairs of pilots had to switch over every 15 minutes. Glider co-pilot shortages were such that even infantrymen were sometimes asked to volunteer, given a few minutes, ground instruction, and then handed control en route to an LZ. This was often the case during Operation Market in the Netherlands, since GP casualties in Normandy had not been made up. Major General James Gavin of the 82nd ABN Div commented, "Fortunately, the Waco is not too hard to fly or land, but having to do it for the first time in combat is a chastening experience." Britain. British GPs were assigned to the Glider Pilot Regiment and Army organization, but were attached to RAF transport groups to fly RAF gliders. Again, who GPs were to belong to was a point of contention between the RAF, which owned the gliders, and the Army, whose troops they had to transport, and who they were expected to fight alongside once on the ground. The glider pilot regent was authorized in December 1941 and established on February 24, 1942. along with the parachute regiment formed from existing parachute, BNS on August 1, 1942, and the Army pilots assigned to RAF, Air Observation, post squadrons, i.e. artillery spotters. These organizations comprised the new Army Air Corps, to which the Special Air Service was added in 1944. The GPs were recruited from the Army, assigned to the glider pilot regiment, and trained by the RAF to fly gliders under RAF control. They had to pass a flight physical and meet other RAF requirements. They first attended 6 weeks of selection at the glider pilot regiment depot at Tilstead, Wiltshire. Brigade of Guards instructors maintained high standards, and washouts were returned to unit. Those who passed selection then attended one of 4 12-week elementary flying training schools, Nose 3, 16, 21, 29, getting 20 flying hours on open cockpit Tiger Moth biplanes. This was followed by one of 5 12-week glider training schools using the small Hotspurs. They then progressed to number 21 or 22 glider operational training unit later. Heavy glider conversion units for 6 weeks, and horses, selected individuals, were trained to fly Hamel cars, and if successful, were posted to the glider. Pilot Regent's Sea Squadron. The final step was the 2-week battle course. 2. Learn infantry battle drill and weapons employment, including German types. With shortages of GPs in early 1944, a second glider pilot or co-pilot course was implemented of only 3 weeks duration. Glider pilots were sergeants and staff sergeants. Sergeant GP drew 12 shillings 6 pence per day more than 6 times the base rate for an infantry private. The glider pilot regiment suffered 60% losses at Arnhem in September 1944, and since sufficient replacements were not yet available for the Rhine crossing in March 1945, 1,500 experienced RAF sergeant and officer pilots were drafted unwillingly into the regiment. Besides being quickly trained in horses, they received limited ground combat training. 60% of the SCPs lost during the Rhine crossing were drafted RAF pilots. Germany. The typical Luftwaffe glider pilot Segelflugs. Furr was a senior NCO of Unterfeldwebel or Feldwebel rank, who had passed the A and B tests. Following previous glider training, they received no powered aircraft instruction, but were well grounded in the principles of flight, weather, and weather flying techniques. They undertook 6 weeks military glider training, including blind flying and spot landings, at Ausbildungskommandos. Leisten Segelflug training commands for cargo glider flight, and also received ground combat training. The glider schools operated at Dernburg, Hildesheim, Erhan, Rossitten, and Sayat, and pilots were awarded the glider pilot badge upon graduation. They were then assigned to a transport wing, or 2 air landing squadrons, subunits of Luftlandungsschwader, 1 with DFS, 2 30s, or Luftlandungsschwader 2, with Go 242s. Flight pay Flieger's allege was about 50 Reichsmarks a month, roughly equivalent to 20 United States dollars or £5 sterling. Glider pilots in ground combat. It's an issue that was not always fully resolved was what GPs were supposed to do once their passengers had disembarked. The British had the most effective and structured solution to this question. In January 1944, the glider pilot regents existing 1st and 2nd BNs were redesignated as 2 wings, with 3 or 4 squadrons each. A squadron, commanded by a major, consisted of an HQ flight and 4 glider flights, each with 4 officers and 48 NCOs commanded by a captain or lieutenant. In practice, flights were cross-attached between squadrons as missions required. Once the troops were delivered, the GPs formed into rifle units. On paper, a wing equated to a lightly armed rifle battalion, squadrons to companies, and flights to large platoons. In reality, owing to casualties and scattered landings, these ad hoc units were much under strength and lacked crew, served weapons. Nevertheless, GPs were expected to maintain a high standard of military training. Armed with Sten guns, rifles, and pistols, they fought alongside the infantry, if necessary, More often, they guarded unit HQs, artillery positions, and prisoners formed a reserve and secured critical sites in the rear. They were to be evacuated as soon as possible, though not before the wounded. Since German glider operations were on small scale, there were few Luftwaffe GPs. On the ground, they were indistinguishable from paratroopers, were trained in infantry schools and normally fought alongside their passengers, typically armed with an MP40 machine pistol and a handgun. The Americans were the least organized in regard to the GP's ground role. They had no pre-planned subunit organization like the British, nor precise guidelines for employment. The main reason for this was because they belonged to the Air Forces, who did not want to see them used as infantry. Much time, effort, and expense had gone into their training. Most were directed to assemble at an artillery or other units command post to perform security and await evacuation. The reality was that most GPs, being independent-minded, simply did what they wanted. They had latitude in selecting weapons, and while only authorized a pistol, most acquired a carbine or submachine gun. They quickly carried a day's rations and minimal field gear. Many added themselves to parachute units. Some guarded prisoners and marched them to the rear. Others were put to work in command posts or even pressed into service as officers' aides. In Normandy, many headed straight to the beaches too. It's a boat ride back to England, but in one instance in the Netherlands, 300 GPS, foreign force the 505th PIR when it came. It's under counterattack. Glider-delivered units. Both US and British glider-delivered forces were comprised of assigned units, rather than individual volunteers. In the British case, there were numerous changes of personnel, while units underwent training and shook down in their new role, and in both cases, individuals would be reassigned if they proved prone to air sickness or an inordinate fear of flying. British air landing troops received extra airborne pay of 1 shilling per day, so increasing by 50%, a private's base rate of 2 South and sported insignia that marked them out as members of an elite, the prestigious Maroon Beret, and the Airborne Force's sleeve patch and title, a point of contention between the flamboyant U.S. volunteer paratroopers and the non-volunteer glider riders was that the latter received no extra hazardous duty pay, nor special insignia other than a glider cap patch, which in 1944 was replaced with a universal parachute can glider patch for all airborne troops. Nor could they wear paratroopers' uniform items, including initially the coveted jump. Gliderman felt second class, and veterans are quick to point out that gliderman is found in no dictionary. They finally received a hazardous duty pay supplement on June 4, 1944, buttonly half that paid to paratroopers, $25 per month for enlisted men and $50 for officers. However, in recognition of their casualties in Normandy, glider pay was doubled to match jump pay 1 month later. 2. The U.S. Airborne Division was organized in theory with 2 glider infantry regiments GUR and 1 parachute infantry regiment PIR, the opposite to the ratio employed by the British. With experience, the reality became somewhat different. The 82nd Airborne Div began life with 1 glider and 2 parachute regiments with a 3rd PIR. Added in mid-1944, the 101st ABN Div maintained 2 GRS, but one was split in mid-1944 to provide 3rd battalions to the 82nd and 101st GIRs, and the division had 2 or 3 additional PIRs attached. By early 1945, the other divisions had each given up their 2nd GIRs and received a 2nd PIR. The capabilities of the glider-borne units in U.S. and British airborne divisions were drastically different. Even with 2 GIRs, the U.S. Airborne Division fielded only 4 glider battalions, each of 3 companies with 2 platoons each, for a total of 12 companies and 24 platoons, 6 companies, and 12 platoons in a single GUR. In early 1945, with the addition of a 3rd battalion and 3rd platoons to the companies the 1 GUR division had, 9 glider-borne companies with 27 platoons. On the British side, the single divisional air landing brigade had 3 battalions, each with 4 companies, with 4 platoons apiece, 16 platoons in a battalion, or 12 companies and 48 platoons in the brigade. Granted, 4 platoon companies were somewhat unwieldy, requiring a broader span of control and not being as agile as a 3 platoon company. Additionally, such an organization required many more tugs, gliders, and pilots. However, in the initial stages of an assault landing, such an abundance of troops generally allowed an adequate force to assemble. Thus, glider unit organization. The Glider Infantry Regiment GUR possessed only 2 rifle battalions of 3 companies, for a total of 1,806 troops. It owed its compact size to glider. So for an approximate comparison of relative U.S.-British Army pay, under the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1940, the US-UK exchange rate was pegged at just over $4 US to £1 sterling. So, $1 equated to roughly 5 shillings in pre-decimal currency. The pound comprised 20 shillings, each of 12 pence. In late 1942, the U.S. private soldiers' base monthly pay 7th grade in the USA, without any of the available supplements, was $30, or roughly £7.10, 0D £7 and 50 pence sterling. The British private's basic monthly pay was £3 South 0D. Thus, the Tommy's classic complaint about the difficulty of finding female company when off duty. There was nothing wrong with the Yanks, except that they were overpaid, oversexed, and overhear capacity, which was even more restrictive than that of C-47 transports. The regimental headquarters company consisted of a regimental HQ company, HQ platoon operations and intelligence sections, reconnaissance group, communication platoon, and 2 at platoons 4 by 37 mm guns each. The Serviceco had a company HQ and regimental HQ and transportation platoons. There was also a company-sized medical detachment. The Glider Infantry Battalion had an HQ company and 3 rifle companies. The HQ company had a battalion HQ company HQ mortar platoon 6 by 81 mm and heavy machine gun platoon for XHMG. The rifle company had an HQ, only 2 rifle platoons, and a weapons platoon 2XLMG 2 by 60 mm mortar. The rifle platoon had an HQ and 3 rifle squads. The former included a 60 mm mortar crew, but these were usually given to the weapons platoon. Separate glider infantry battalions were designated the 88th and 550th Airborne INTH-BNs. It was the 88th that originally tested glider tactics. The December 1944 TONE, implemented in early 1945, saw the addition of a 3rd battalion to the GUR, plus a 3rd platoon to each rifle company, giving an increase to 2,975 troops with 860. It was not implemented until March 1945 in Europe and July 1945 for the 11th ABN Div, the Pacific Theater. 3rd battalions were obtained from disbanded glider regiments. 1st and 2nd BNs, 401st GUR became the 3rd BNs of the 327th and 325th GIRs, respectively, and had already been attached to those regiments. Since March, the 193rd GUR and 550th ABN INTH-BN were deactivated too. Fill out the 194th GUR? Crew-served weapon allocation changed to 8X HMGs. Instead of 4 and 6 by 57 mm at guns, replace the 8 by 37 mm guns. The 384-man Glider Field Artillery Battalion GFAB had an HQ and 2 service battery, and 2 howitzer batteries, each with 6 by 75 mm pack howitzers, instead of the standard FA battalion's 3 4-gun batteries, plus a medical detachment. 4 of the battalions were rearmed with 105 mm M3 snub nose howitzers. The 320th in February 1943, 907th, March 1944, 675th, January 1945, and 677th and 680th, February. The shield was removed from the M3A1 carriage so that it could be carried in a glider. The other units retained 75mm pack howitzers for glider insertion and might receive the 105mm pieces when they linked up with a sea-landed or overland echelon. The 505-man Airborne Anti-Aircraft Battalion was unique to airborne divisions and was considered a glider unit. On paper, it included an HQ and HQ detachment, 3 automatic weapons batteries, 3 machine gun batteries, and a medical detachment. The 2 and allotted 8 by 37mm at or 40mm AA guns per automatic weapons battery in 2. Initially, batteries AC had only 37mm at guns, but by 1944 they had 57mm guns. They never actually possessed 40mm AA guns and were purely at units, leading to them being called at batteries. The machine gun batteries, lettered DF, had 12x.50 cal guns each and were referred to as AA batteries. In practice, unnecessary for solely air defense, they were employed against ground targets. Glider infantry regiments were also supported by a 103-man engineer co. glider from the division's Airborne Engineer BNKAs, A and B, in a division with 2 GIRs. U.S. glider troops uniforms. American glider troops wore the same field uniforms as other ground troops. From 1942, their only specific distinction was the glider patch, a circular, embroidered insignia worn on the left front side of the garrison cap right side. For officers who wore their rank on the left, it had a light blue background, for infantry and red for artillery and engineers, with a white border and white glider motif. In August 1944, it was replaced with a similar patch with medium blue backing, red border, and a white glider superimposed on a white parat. This was worn by both glider and parachute troops. Branch colors worn as piping on enlisted men's garrison caps were infantry, light blue, artillery, red, engineers, interwoven red and white. Glider troops were also belatedly authorized jump boots at this time. The glider badge was finally authorized for glider troops in June 1944. Worn over the left breast pocket, it had the same silver upswept wings as the parachutist badge, but with a front view of a CG for a glider rather than a parachute. To earn it, a man had to be attached to a glider or airborne unit, and to have satisfactorily completed a course of instruction involving at least one practice glider landing with combat equipment, or to have participated in at least one combat glider mission into enemy-held territory. It was discontinued only in May 1961, although glider training had ceased in 1948 and was eliminated as a unit requirement in January 1953. British Air Landing Unit Organization. The war establishment of an 86-man British Air Landing Infantry Battalion called for a battalion HQ support and AA at companies, and for rifle companies. The support company possessed an HQ and signals transport, administrative, pioneer, reconnaissance, and mortar platoons 4x3 in mortar. The rifle company had a headquarters, support section 2x3 in mortar, and 4 rifle platoons, each with 3 sections. Platoon weapons included 3 Bren guns and a 2-inch mortar and Piat anti-tank projector with the HQ element. From 1944, the support companies for mortar and the rifle companies 8 mortars were consolidated into a mortar group with 2 platoons of 6 tubes, each for more effective fire control. In practice, the AA-AT company was organized differently from the official establishment. It was supposed to have 2 AA platoons, each with 2 jeep-drawn trailers bearing 20mm Hispano, Suiza, automatic cannon on No, 2 Mk2 Spider ground mounts. These were not needed for air defense and proved ineffective for anti-tank use. So the AA element reorganized into a machine gun platoon with 8x.303 Vickers MMGs. Most units later reorganized again into 2 4-gun platoons. The companies. 2 AT platoons each had 4 jeep-drawn 6 PDR guns. The air landing battalions, with 4 companies each of 4 platoons, This gave the division's air landing brigade 48 platoons, nearly the same strength as the sum of its 2 parachute brigades, each composed of 3 battalions, with 3 companies of 3 platoons, totaling 54 platoons. The air landing brigade headquarters also included a defense platoon. Each airborne division possessed a battalion-size air landing light regiment, Royal Artillery, with 3 batteries each divided into 2 4-gun troops with U.S. 75mm pack howitzers. 1 battery normally supported each of the division's parachute and air landing brigades. The 1st ABN Div's 1st ALLT Regent Ra had batteries numbered 1, 2, and 3. The 6th ABN Div's 53rd Worcestershire Yeomanry LT Regent Ra consisted of 210, 211, and 212 batteries. In the far east, the 44th Indian ABN Div had the 159th Perked Arty Regent Ra with 553, 554, and 555 batteries. Each of the divisions in Europe possessed air landing, light anti-tank batteries, Ra 1st ABN, Div 1st and 2nd BTIs, 6th ABN Div, 3rd and 4th BTIs, each battery having 4 troops of 4x6 PDR at guns prior to 1,943, 2 PDR guns, and 2 troops with 4x7. The 1st ABN Div's 1st LTAABT had 3 troops each with 8x20mm cannon. The 6th ABN Div's 2nd LTAABTY had 1 troop of 18x40mm Bofors Mk1 guns on Mk4 mounts, and 2 troops each with 24x. The 20mm Hispano-Suiza cannon were replaced in March 1944 by 20mm Polston guns. Both types had 2 Mk2 mounts and were towed on Jeep trailers. The 52nd Lowland Infantry Div was trained as an air landing division in July 1944. It was to have been used at Arnhem, but was never employed in that role, and went on to fight as conventional infantry. British Air Landing Troops uniforms. British Air Landing Troops wore the same combat uniform as paratroopers, including the rimless steel jump helmet and the Denison smock over airborne-style battledress with enlarged trouser pockets. After completing glider training, infantry wore a 1 3/4 in khaki oval patch on the right forearm of battledress, showing an embroidered Horsa glider in light blue with black thread detailing. Reportedly, the oval was occasionally edged with the Tradizione, color of the parent regiment. This badge wasn't authorized by the War Office, so must have. It's been produced and distributed on the initiative of airborne forces. All units displayed on both upper sleeves the Airborne Forces maroon square formation patch with a light blue Pegasus motif, and below this, a straight Airborne tab in the same colors. The traditional cap badge of their parent regiment, or corps, was worn above the left eye on the Maroon Airborne Forces, beret in white, yellow or bronze metal, or economy wartime plastic of the same colors. In addition to their new Army Air Corps uniform distinctions, the constituent units of the AL brigades retained their parent regiment's designation. Arc-shaped shoulder titles in regimental corps colors, mostly as specified in a CI 905 of June 12, 1943. Infantry units normally wore white lettering on scarlet. Exceptions included the 2nd South Staffords, who wore yellow serif lettering S. Staffords on maroon, the often illustrated yellow on maroon title South Stafford, incorporating a glider motif, in fact, dates from the 1950s. The 1st Royal Ulster Rifles, who wore black lettering on rifle green, and the 2nd Black Watch, who instead of a title wore a large tartan patch of complex shape. The 1st Argylls wore Wheaton Red A and SH titles for some time. After these were officially replaced by a white and red diced patch from December 25, 1943. A number of unofficial formats of regimental titles were also to be seen, usually on Best BD for walking out. British Armyholder titles are a complex subject. For details, see Brian L. Davis, British Army Uniforms and Insignia of World War II, Arms and Armor Press, 1983, particularly pp. 103, to 107. German air landing units. If necessary, any German paratroopers or other troops could conduct glider operations, and there was no specialized training other than practice and rapid debarking and unloading. The only dedicated German glider unit was Luftlandesturm Regiment 1, Air Landing Assault Regiment 1, which was raised from trained paratroopers. The original unit was formed in November 1939 from elements of Fallschirmjäger Regiment 1 Parachute Light Infantry Regiment 1 under the title Vers Exabteilung Friedrichshafen Experimentation. Battalion Friedrichshafen, named after its location. It was soon redesignated Sturmabteilung Koch, Assault Battalion Koch, named after its commander, to seize Fort Eben Amel in Belgium in May 1940.